So I want to continue our discussion on job satisfaction, job dissatisfaction as an attitude with some of the consequences of job dissatisfaction. Probably the biggest one is obviously the higher we find people are dissatisfied with their work, whether we're looking at it as a model that involves job dissatisfaction and job satisfaction as separate constructs, or if we're just looking at a global measure of job satisfaction and finding people that are less satisfied. The biggest thing it predicts is employee withdrawal, activities such as chronic absenteeism, voluntary turnover, i.e. quitting, that enables employees to escape adverse organizations and situations. Also, we tend to find counter workplace behaviors, so such as stealing, manipulating work to make it look like you're working more than you are, talking badly about coworkers, in other words, spreading your dissatisfaction. So all of those are outcomes and obviously are negative outcomes that we want to avoid if we can in the workforce of an organization. So the two big ones that are often looked at again are absenteeism and turnover, but that's not the only impacts of having dissatisfied workers. So if the biggest thing we're really looking at is people leaving, turnover, one of the things we can think about then is what actually predicts someone that is going to leave. And we find that in general, job satisfaction or dissatisfaction is related to turnover, but it's a much more complex process. So that's led to the unfolding model of voluntary turnover, a model that explains the cognitive, so basically the thinking process, through which people make decisions about quitting or staying on their jobs. And what this has found is that the decisions are dependent on basically two things. So the two main things we want to know about if we're trying to determine if someone is likely to leave their job, more so than their satisfaction, is one, we want to see, has there been a major event that would make people think about leaving their job? So an attention-getting event that gets employees to think about their jobs, mergers with other companies, downsizing, maybe they didn't get a promotion they wanted. So generally, most people that leave an organization leave due to a straw that breaks the camel's back kind of situation. There is a shock to the system. There's something that makes them start thinking about, maybe this isn't the right job for me. And without that event, without that clear shock, actually people are less likely to leave their jobs. So that's the first thing, is that we want to be aware, especially if we're trying to maintain or manage potential turnover or reduce turnover, that we want to be very cognizant of shocks to the system, things that might make people consider leaving their jobs. The next thing that's really important is the individual's decision frames. It's a set of internalized rules and images regarding how to interpret something that has occurred, i.e., based on what I know from the past, what is the obvious response? So for instance, if the shock to the system is a layoff and the person has suffered through multiple layoffs in the organization and their job has never been threatened, they're probably much more likely to think to themselves, well, this is not a great event, I'm not happy about it, but I know my job's still secure, so I'm not really going to think about turnover. However, in that same situation where an organization is basically downsizing, people are being terminated, and the decision frame is, I have no idea if my job is safe. This is the first time this has ever happened to me, and no one's communicating that I'm valued and safe. Therefore, I feel threatened, and I'm going to start looking to see if there is anything else out there. So it's this two-part kind of model of unfolding turnover, which means that usually speaking, not all, but most turnover involves a shock to the system, followed by individuals who have a set of rules or decision frame that encourages them to believe that they are now threatened by that shock to the system. By the way, the voluntary turnover model of kind of trying to determine behaviors based on what's going on in the environment is not just for turnover. The shock to the system and decision frames, maybe by different terms, is also used to look at a lot of decisions that we make in our lives. There's a lot of times where, think about if you've ever had a vehicle that you probably should have gotten rid of a long time ago, but you wait till it actually has a repair that you can't afford. That's a shock to the system. Your decision frame, this vehicle is not salvageable, means that you are now willing to get rid of the vehicle and get a new one. But both of those things greatly predict whether or not this is actually going to happen. And without that shock to the system, you're probably likely to keep going with the way things have always been. We tend to find stasis until there's a shock to the system that makes us, on average, consider changing. When we look at job satisfaction and task performance, we do find there's a relationship, and it is positive. Higher job satisfaction does tend to result and higher task performance. But the first thing is to recognize is that it's not very strong, and it's hard to really define a direction. In other words, are people that perform well also more likely to be satisfied, or are people who are more satisfied more likely to perform well? So if we look at this relationship, there's probably more going on than just job satisfaction and task performance. So for one, in many work settings, there's little room for large changes in performance. So a lot of jobs that we look at job satisfaction, task performance, doesn't really matter how satisfied you are. It might be predicting whether you stay with the company and how loyal and pleasant you are to be around. But your task is set by the company. You have to do X amount of something on a particular product or machine. And if you don't make those tasks, you're most likely going to either be put on an improvement plan or removed from the company. So there's not an enormous amount of variance there in task performance. Additionally, job satisfaction and performance are likely not directly linked. They may be related to a single concept that's related to both. For example, job performance and satisfaction may be linked to rewards. The higher your rewards, the more you're being paid, the higher your job satisfaction, and the higher your task performance. So there's a lot of research on this. Generally, like I said, there is a relationship, but it's not necessarily, if you will, a smoking gun of directly increased job satisfaction and you'll see an increase in task performance. It seems to be a much more complex relationship. So how do we promote job satisfaction if that's our goal? And in general, most of the research has shown it's not a bad goal for an organization to have. There are a lot of positive outcomes of having satisfied workforce, and there's negative outcomes of having a dissatisfied workforce. So partly it's thinking about making jobs fun, and that's a very simple statement, but it basically means the more enjoyable the job is, the more varied it is, the more it actually uses the person's talents and skills in a way that they can understand and see the impact on what they're doing in the organization, the more likely they are going to be higher satisfied. We want to pay people fairly, so the more likely someone is being paid fairly for their amount of work, that the pay is the equivalent that they would get for the same type of work in other organizations, again, we're likely to see good job satisfaction. Match people to jobs that fit their interests. So again, if we have a sales position that requires extreme extroversion, we probably wouldn't want to select someone that's very introverted. It's not that they couldn't do that job, it's that it's going to be stressful, it's going to take them more effort, and that effort is probably going to result in lower job satisfaction. If at all possible, when designing jobs, we want to avoid boring and repetitive jobs, and we also want to improve the quality of supervision. So that's generally when we ask what factors are most related to poor job performance, we find boring jobs, unfair pay, bad match between the person and the job, boring repetitive jobs, and poor supervision. So the obvious opposites of this to increase job satisfaction is to focus on these areas. So let's move on and take a look at some other factors that we want to consider in organizational behavior. So what about job satisfaction in tough times? We do want to be open and honest about the company's financial situation. So no one enjoys finding out that their position has been removed, that they've been terminated. No one enjoys finding out they're not going to get a bonus. However, you can mitigate this through communication, and that's going to be a reoccurring theme throughout this class. And it's something that most organizations are not very good at. A lot of organizations, for various reasons, like to keep their cards basically concealed from their employees. They don't like to share this information. But the more open and honest you are in your communication, the less the impact is on individuals' job satisfaction. So you do also want to maybe highlight and identify your top workers, the ones that you want to make sure you retain through the process, through the tough times, and really focus on their job satisfaction and developing their career. And you also want to think about breaking assignments into manageable chunks. So basically, can we redesign the work while we're in these tough times to make the jobs more manageable for everyone working in them? And again, as much as possible, pay people what they're worth within even tough times. The next one we're going to talk about is organizational commitment. So if you're working or your friends and family are working, what have their employees done to keep them there? Have you seen a decrease in hiring or an increase? So really, when we're thinking about whether someone enjoys working at a place, there's also the factor of are they committed to working at the place? And that's a little bit different than job satisfaction. Job satisfaction is not necessarily capturing a loyalty to the organization. It's not necessarily capturing a willingness to talk the organization up to others. Job satisfaction is purely, are you satisfied with your job and the organization you work with? And that's why organizational commitment is another attitude that we're very interested in. So you can think about, why are you still at your current job or your school or your situation? Why are you committed? What type of commitment do you have that's keeping you there? And again, our focus here is going to be primarily organizational commitment, but you could definitely use this same model to look at relationships, to look at family and friends, and even look at your education. So when we're thinking about commitment, like any attitude, we first want to kind of define what we're talking about. So organizational commitment has been basically broken down into three subcategories. So organizational commitment itself is the extent to which an individual identifies and is involved with his or her organization and is unwilling to leave it. In other words, you're committed to the organization. So you identify as being a part of the organization. You're involved with the organization. You go to social events off hours for the organization. You might wear clothing that lets people know you work for the organization. That's all signs of commitment. But it also means that you're committed to not leaving the organization, to staying with the organization. So the more someone expresses organizational commitment, also the less likely they are to leave, even with a shock to the system. Now, within that organizational commitment, there is three subtypes of commitment. There's continuance, affective, and normative. So continuous commitment is the strength of a person's desire to continue working for an organization because he or she needs to do so and cannot afford to leave. This is pretty much defined by, if you've ever heard anyone say, the checks don't bounce. Got to make the payment somehow. Often, sometimes this is also referred to as golden handcuffs, where you're actually in a job that you're not necessarily satisfied with anymore, but you know, I'm not going to get a better pay structure or benefit structure than I currently have. Therefore, even though I might want to leave, I'm not going to leave. That's continuous commitment. And that's not necessarily going to result in you being very positive to the organization or supporting the organization, but it also means you're unlikely to leave the organization. The next one is affective commitment, and that is basically an emotional response. The strength of a person's desire to work for an organization because he or she agrees with its underlying goals and values, truly believe in what the company stands for. So this is kind of that component of really being involved with the company, enjoying the company emotionally, having a positive attitude towards the company, and talking the company up to others. Obviously, affective commitment is very important, and a lot of organizations want to do what they can to support this concept. But again, it's just a part of the overall commitment. And finally, there's normative commitment, the strength of a person's desire to continue working for an organization because he or she feels obligations from others to remain there, i.e., your parents would be very disappointed if you dropped out of school. So you're not staying there because you have to monetarily. You're not staying there because you love the organization or have a positive attitude. You're staying there because it's expected of you. So people with a strong concept of work ethic often also experience a fair amount of normative commitment. If you are not very fond of the company or the work you do, but you very much like everyone you work with, and you feel like if you left, that it would be an undue burden on them for them having to make up for you leaving, that would be normative commitment. So obviously an organization wants to basically take advantage of all of these as they can, and ideally they want someone that is normatively, effectively, and continuance committed to the organization. They're paying enough that you don't want to leave, you actually like the organization, and you're expected to stay with the organization. So someone that's high on all three of these is very unlikely to leave the organization. As we kind of mix and match, we start to enter an area where people are more likely to leave. If someone's low on all three, they're low on continuous, they're low on effective, and they're low on normative, we'd expect that person to be a very high flight risk. And obviously this then creates a spectrum between that high on all three and low on all three combination. So much like job satisfaction, we want to think about, how do we develop commitment? So we want to make the jobs interesting and give people responsibility. We want to empower people. So for most people, they actually have more commitment, especially affective and continuous commitment, the more they're using their skills. We want to align the interests of the company with those of the employees. Profit sharing plans make people actually involved. So sharing stock, for instance, having bonuses that are based on performance, but also just basically making sure that there's an alignment between the goals and the stated kind of values of the company and the people that are working for the company. You need to be enthusiastic about your recruitment of new employees whose values closely match those of the organization. So that isn't necessarily a process of removing people if they don't agree, but probably making a measure of their values and an understanding of our new employees strongly valuing the same values that we are is going to automatically lead to a level of higher commitment long term. And finally, listen to your employees. Interviews, take suggestions seriously, pay attention to their concerns. This can also work the other way of adapting the organization's values to meet the employees. All of these are examples of how to build up commitment. So, why does commitment matter? Much like job satisfaction, it is related to positive and negative outcomes. Committed employees are much less likely to withdraw. So, it's not just leaving the organization, it's also, again, those workplace behaviors, stealing, theft, reporting inappropriate time hours, etc. Also, committed employees are willing to make sacrifices for the organization. We tend to see the more committed you are, the more likely you are to do OCBs, organizational citizenship behaviors, so positive behaviors, more likely to attend various events like company picnics, etc. All of this kind of builds up that, again, we are interested in commitment because if someone's highly satisfied and highly committed, we would predict that they're much less likely to leave the organization, much more likely to be productive, and much more likely to be helping out as needed.